because you know him, right? Okay, let's start.
Let's go. Let's do it. I know you're still catching your breath from a very powerful experience you just had in the cinema, so we'll get to some of the themes and issues of Look of Silence at some point, but I think we're going to look a little bit bigger picture to start with. I want to get a sense, first of all, how many people have also seen Act of Killing, because obviously we're talking about so half-ish. Okay. Because also we're obviously talking about films which are companion pieces to each other to some extent. But I think it's because this is mainly a room of producers and directors who are in a process of developing works in the context of this clinic that you're doing now. I think it's interesting to talk about how Joshua first came to make these two films in the context of his own professional and artistic life. And so to get a little bit of sense of the bigger picture of how you were working, give us a sense of what you were doing and where you're at before you came to the idea of making a film about the atrocities in Indonesia in 1965. What was going on in your life before that point, and what kind of work were you doing?
So in 2001, I was making the transition from being a kind of experimental, a director who'd made some experimental fiction shorts that combined documentary and fiction, but saw myself fundamentally as someone who would write scripts and make fiction, to picking up a camera and trying to use, to make experimental documentaries. And I was interested in particularly collaboration and performance, how whenever you film anybody, they start to perform for your camera. They start staging themselves. That's what always happens when you film everybody. And I was interested in what that means, what that makes visible, what that makes possible. And I was experimenting on those issues, those themes. It was in the early days of digital video and being able to make your own films at home with editing on a computer on Final Cut Pro. And it was incredibly liberating to put the script behind and just start making things. And I was experimenting with those questions of performance and collaboration when a friend, a labor organizer, asked me, would you like to explore the violence that underpins contemporary globalization by going to Indonesia and making a film about people struggling to organize a union in the aftermath of the Suharto dictatorship? And I said, I don't know anything about Indonesia, and indeed I didn't know the difference between Indonesia and Malaysia, or Micronesia, Melanesia. I'm still a little hazy about the last two. I didn't know anything about Indonesia, and it was only a 6-month project. They had a tight deadline. So I said, I really don't feel like capable of directing a film in this context, but I can maybe set up a workshop where the workers themselves make their own film. And we can screen films together, but I would need to find very good local filmmakers with whom to collaborate, who can not only translate, but also open up the world of documentary and experimental film for these plantation workers, many of whom couldn't read. So it was there was a huge cultural and economic gap across which I was trying to work. And we went in 2001, and I encountered really terrible conditions on that plantation. I guess I was 28 years old, 27 years old. And on this plantation, you're young and impressionable at 27. And on this plantation, I was on a Belgian-owned oil palm plantation, company called Société Financière, or French for Financial Society. It's a very Orwellian kind of Big Brother sort of name. And this company was making the women workers spray a weed killer with no protective clothing, no masks, no gloves, no toxic chemical suits. And the mist was getting into their lungs, then into their bloodstream, then into their livers, and killing them in their 40s. And they were afraid to do much about it, because when they would even submit a petition to the company's headquarters in the city of Medan, where I would go on to make the act of killing, the company would hire a group called Pancasila Youth, which is the paramilitary group you see in the act of killing, to either beat the women up or to threaten them or to intimidate them in other ways. And they were easily intimidated, it turned out, because their parents and their grandparents had been in a strong plantation workers union until 1965, had been accused of being potential communist sympathizers simply for being in the union, and they were killed. And the plantation workers were afraid this could happen again because the killers were still in power. And this is the kind of thing that if you walk from the comforts of London in your mid-20s into such a situation, you don't turn away easily and go home. So after we made the first film, after the plantation workers, I should say, made this first film called The Globalization Tapes, they said, come back and why don't we make another film together where we have more time about why we are afraid, about what it's like for us to live surrounded by the still powerful perpetrators. And I returned immediately in 2003 to begin that work, and that was that was the start of the 10-year process that would lead to the act of killing and to the Look of Silence.
What was the initial point of contact, idea? Where did that first bit of inspiration came that led you on the path of the film that would become Act of Killing?
Well, first of all, I'm really aware of this right now as I finish a decade of work. I'm not a filmmaker who looks for an interesting story or an interesting idea. I look for a theme and a context that makes me profoundly curious, and I see the filmmaking process as a way of excavating, exploring. I see myself as an explorer more than a storyteller. And when we started working with the survivors, first of all, and this will become relevant to the Look of Silence, so I'll say it now while we're at this point chronologically. There was one victim whose name on that plantation and for miles around was virtually synonymous with the whole genocide. And that victim was Romley. And that's because Romley's murder had witnesses. Everybody else would just be taken to rivers, decapitated, and dumped. No one knew what happened to them, but people saw Romley dying, and they found his body, and there was a grave on the plantation. So to speak, for the survivors to speak about Romley was to insist that these events happened in defiance of a military which was threatening the survivors to pretend that nothing had happened. And when you're traumatized, but can't speak about the source of that trauma, you can't heal, you can't make sense of what happened to you. So it was very important, it was a matter of survival for the survivors to be able to talk about Romley, at least about Romley. He was an irrefutable fact. And so the survivors would speak about Romley almost to pinch themselves, to remind themselves that they were still awake, that these events had really happened. And I very quickly, therefore it was inevitable when we started working together that the survivors would introduce me to Romley's family. I met Romley's mother and father and fell in love with them immediately. I met Romley's brothers and sisters, and then one day I met Romley's youngest brother, who was 25 years younger than Romley, and his name was Adi. You've all just met him too. And Adi was living in the city of Medan, was visiting home, and when he met me it was a very important day for him because he grew up being born after the killings. He was not traumatized in the same way as everybody else, but he was desperate to understand what had happened, that had made his father the way he is, that had made his mother the way she is, that had made his brothers and sisters the way they are, that had made his community the way it is, that had made the country the way it is. In school, Adi would be made to stand at the front of the class and be singled out by the teacher for being the only relative of a communist in high school. So he was being picked on and bullied by his own high school teachers. He was trying to understand all that. And he saw in my filmmaking the means to do so. Very quickly, though, after I met Adi, he would help me gather survivors from his village and neighboring villages to talk to me. Very quickly, and we were talking about what could we do to express this history. We were gathering old village opera performers who had been banned from practicing their art, talked about staging an opera that would resurrect these memories. Because the art was considered subversive. This form of village opera called Ludruk was considered subversive and was seen as communist, and they weren't allowed to perform it in North Sumatra. We were talking about gathering survivors and gathering testimony, figuring out how could this history be expressed. when suddenly the army threatened all of the survivors not to participate in the film, one by one. And
So you were starting to make a film essentially about the survivors, the victims, and
when the survivors and the victims were told they couldn't participate in the film. Then they said, Josh, but by then I'd been there for a long time, they knew me well, they said, don't just quit and go home. Why don't you try and film the perpetrators? See if they'll tell you what happened to our relatives. And I was afraid to do that at first, but when I did, I found to my real horror that all of them were, and shock, that all of them were immediately open about the worst details of the killings, which they would recount with smiles on their faces in front of their wives and their children and even their small grandchildren. And when I showed that material back to the survivors and to Adi and to the broader, and recognizing that I had something extremely powerful, back to the Indonesian human rights community as a whole, everybody said, keep filming the perpetrators. Most people said, because you're finding out what happened. But Adi said something, a few people, and especially Adi, said something that really cuts to the core of what the act of killing would become. He said, keep filming the perpetrators because anyone in Indonesia or abroad who hears the way they are speaking will recognize at once that there's something terribly wrong here today. So essentially he was saying, make an expose about today's Indonesia. Don't make a film about what happened in 1965, one of many horrible chapters of the 20th century. Make a film about now. And I then spent 2 years, from 2003 to 2005, feeling entrusted by Adi and the other survivors in the human rights community to do a work that they couldn't do themselves. I spent 2 years filming every perpetrator I could find, working my way from that
Talk a little bit
village.
about, a little bit about meeting these people, gaining their trust so that they would tell you the stories they came to tell you.
Well, first of all, the whole film, the whole act of killing, and in a way the Look of Silence, the whole project, the two films, are a response to the fact that that these men would openly boast before I gained any trust, before they would open up to me as human beings, they would be boasting. I would have to gain their trust to hear about their nightmares and their pain and their fears, which is something Anwar Congo goes into in the act of killing. But I would simply arrive at these men's houses with a camera, pretending at first, I think because I was a little afraid, I would be pretending to be filming life in the village. And I would say, look, nice to meet you. What did you do for a living? And within minutes, every single time, they would start talking about the killings, because the killings were the single most important thing they'd ever done. They had a need to talk about it, I think, because boasting helped reassure themselves that it was somehow okay. And they wanted to impress me. They were vain. They thought it would catch my attention. So, and then within minutes of that, or within hours of that, minutes to hours as the case may be, anyone who was still able-bodied, which most of them were, still in good physical condition, would invite me to the places where they killed, launch into sort of spontaneous demonstrations of how they killed, because I think that's what they thought you're supposed to have in a film, I guess. And then complain if they hadn't thought to bring along a machete, as you see Amir Hassan do in The Look of Silence, or they hadn't thought to bring along fellow Death Squad veterans to use play the victim. So the scenes you just saw today in The Look of Silence come from this early period of meeting perpetrators from 2003 to 2005, when I filmed the old material that Adi's watching, when I filmed every perpetrator I could find, and every single, and you can see sometimes they would reenact on their wives how they would kill, as you see with the man who shows how he would stab women on his wife. Sometimes with the two men, they would take turns playing victim and perpetrator. But I spent from 2003 to 2005 working my way up the chain of command, filming everybody. I was on a PhD scholarship, so I had a little income, but not much, and on a real shoestring with just a little handy cam, I would follow these men around and film these reenactments. The day in 2005, I met the 41st perpetrator that I filmed after filming people for 2 years, and that was Anwar Congo. But the genesis of the two films was much earlier, about a year and a half before that, maybe 6 months after I started this process. The genesis of the whole project, the origin of the whole project, finally to really answer your question, what was the moment? It was when I filmed those two men taking me down to the river in The Look of Silence, taking turns playing victim and perpetrator. It was that day I'd done something a little different from what I'd done up to then. Because so many of them had complained that they hadn't thought to bring along someone else to reenact with, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to bring along 2 death squad leaders from neighboring villages, people who don't know each other so well, can't plan what to say in advance, can't tell each other what they should and shouldn't say before I get to film them. Then they have someone to work with in the reenactments. I can determine if what happened in this village was the same as what happened in that village. And I get to see how they talk to each other. And what chilled me was that the boasting that I'd seen all these perpetrators do seemed to be a common script. It was like they're reading from a common script. Those 2 men hadn't known each other before. And they're speaking, it's kind of like they're reading from a common script. It made me feel that it was socially, not just socially acceptable, it was expected that they would boast like this. And that's when I had this awful realization that it's as though I've wandered into Germany 40 years after the Holocaust, only to find the Nazis still in power. I imagine that the Nazis might allow their aging death squad veterans, or the aging SS officers rather, to go back to their villages after the Holocaust and boast, if only because that would make them feel better about what they did, so they would remain loyal and not less broken, but also because they would become feared representatives of the state if they boast about atrocities to their nation, to their neighbors. So they would become part of a regime of fear. And I knew at that point I would spend as many years of my life as it would take to address this issue, not least because I could see from my work on that plantation that so much of global capitalism is built on fear and intimidation that has its origins in mass violence that was sponsored by the West. Unlike the Holocaust, my government, the American government, was supporting these killings while they were happening. And I knew that I would make 2 films. I knew it was obvious I couldn't really have survivors and perpetrators in the same film. The survivors were experiencing far too much intimidation for that to be safe. And so I knew that there were 2 separate films to be made. One about what happens when killers win, write a victor's history, impose that history on a whole society. What moral vacuum does that lead to? What corruption and violence and thuggery does that engender? I knew that would be a film about storytelling and fantasy and escapism and guilt. That's the act of killing. And I knew I should make another film equally contemporary, also about today, a film about what does it do to a human being, to a family, to the human spirit, to have to survive, to have to continue living, to have to rebuild a life surrounded by the still powerful perpetrators. What does it do to you to have to live for 50 years in silence and fear? And that became The Look of Silence.
So in a sense, it was almost in sort of practical production terms, you'd spent 2 or 3 years gathering this testimony, in a sense, developing an idea that became the conception of 2 quite different films in terms of their intent and in terms of what would become their conception and aesthetics. Obviously, you had to bring this back to somebody to get funded, and because active killing was, required some resources. You recreated a village, and etc. How do you take that, the clarity of that moment and that idea to becoming a documentary production of immense scope?
Well, for one thing, the method in the act of killing evolved organically. So it wasn't like I had 2 years of research and then thought, okay, the thing to do is to let these men dramatize not so much what they did, because I don't think that's what they're doing in the act of killing. I think they're really dramatizing the narratives that allow them to live with themselves. They're dramatizing the fantasy images that they hold of themselves. And I think that, so in that sense, they're not reenactments at all. They're dramatizations of who they wish they were. And I didn't make the leap from saying, okay, they're going to do from like the simple reenactments you saw today, the old footage that Adi's watching today, to the Born Free scene, if you've seen the act of killing at the waterfall. That wasn't a leap I just made conceptually. It was the process it was the result of an organic process. And the process was this. Long before I met Anwar, but maybe after the scene where the 2 men took me down to the river, that's when the light bulb went off. And I said, okay, I started proposing to the men, look, you've participated in one of the biggest killings in human history. I want to know what it means to you and to your country. You want to show me what you've done. So, I'll let you show me what you've done, however you wish. I'll film your reenactments, but I will also film you and your fellow Death Squad veterans discussing what you want to show, and just as importantly, what you want to leave out. And that way I'll be able to answer this question. What does this mean to you, and what does this mean to your society? Now, why did that method feel like the right method? Because I had the sense that from the perpetrators I was getting something much closer to performance than to sober testimony. If you think of those two men going down to the river, it's a very simple scene to shoot, but it's like they're performing. They're not remembering what happened. As I said earlier, they're reading from a common script. I had this, and performance is always intended for an audience. And the question was, who is their imagined audience? How do they want me to see them? How do they want their grandchildren, in front of whom I've seen them boasting, how do they want their grandchildren to remember them when they die? How do they want you to see them through my camera? How do they want to be seen, and how do they really see themselves? And so that's why I propose this method. And if you think of the method, it wasn't a trick to get them to open up. It was, on the contrary, a response to their openness. That wasn't a way of getting access. It was trying to understand, why is it so easy to get these men to talk? And similarly, there is no film within the film. They're not making a separate film in the act of killing. They're simply making scenes for my film. And that was our agreement, if you like, from the beginning. Anyways, when I met I was proposing that to many men before I met Anwar. When I met Anwar, there was a crucial there was something crucially different about him and about that day. The first day I film Anwar is the day he takes me to the roof and dances the cha-cha-cha. It was just like the first day I filmed Amir Hassan was the day he takes me to the river. And in this scene, it keeps with Inong in the Look of Silence. There was nothing particularly outrageous about him dancing where he'd killed hundreds of people. You saw today in the Look of Silence equally outrageous scenes that I filmed well before that. But what was new about Anwar going up to that roof was that he was unable to suppress a pain. He had to talk about trauma. He said, I go out drinking and taking drugs and dancing to forget what I've done. And then, right after reenacting it, and then as though to banish or get rid of the pain that he's just acknowledged, he says, look, I'm a good dancer, I'll show you, and he starts to dance. And the dancing on the roof was similar to Amir Hassan and Inong posing for those photographs. It was a moment of extraordinary, surreal boasting, bravado even, and yet it was obviously a response to trauma. He just said it. He said, I feel traumatized. And it was at the very least dissociation. But I had this feeling that maybe trauma and boasting are two sides of the same coin. Maybe boasting is a way of not dealing with trauma. It's compensatory, it's defensive. And to explore that, I did something with Anwar the next day I met him, I think, that was different from anything I'd done with anyone else because it was dangerous. It could get us kicked out of the country, I thought, and get my crew in trouble, but we did it. That was to screen for Anwar the footage of that day on the roof. I never dared show the perpetrators the images of themselves, but I did with Anwar because of that pain. And I think I was afraid he would say this makes me look terrible and we'd be kicked out or arrested, and I had my crew at the airport with money ready to buy tickets if they didn't receive a text message saying everything was okay. He looks very disturbed, if you remember that scene in the act of killing. He looks very disturbed watching himself on the roof, and I think he is, but he doesn't dare acknowledge it because to acknowledge it would be to admit that he did something wrong, which is exactly what he's never been forced to do. Instead, he says he needs to change his clothes and dye his hair and do a better job in acting. And he tries to fix what's morally wrong with the scene by fixing the scene aesthetically. And we just kept repeating that process. He would shoot the next scene, then we would film it to him. Screen it for him. Shoot the next scene, we'd screen it for him. And at first the scenes were not too expensive, but we generated a body, now to answer your question, a body of material that I was then gradually able to bring back to funders at home in London. First we were able to raise, I went from my PhD stipend to spending all of that, to spending then a community arts grant that we got, and then a small arts grant. And then we tried to get television support in the UK, that failed. We tried to get Film Institute support in the UK, that failed. No one wanted to be a part of it. Then we but I was able because I had done a PhD.
Was that because you were filming perpetrators or is...
No, actually, I glossed over something. There's a critic of the act of killing who has said some pretty strong things about it, who's a powerful man in the documentary world in the UK. Actually, he'd already rejected the project when I was working with survivors. I'd gone to him very early, before I started filming the perpetrators, with the footage of the survivors, and what he said was, I don't want my strand awash with atrocity. He was a commissioning editor. And so he rejected the film then, and we knew that this was even more horrifying and he wouldn't take it. So we had trouble getting television support in the UK, but I was able, because of my PhD, to get academic support. I was able to get first a postdoctorate fellowship, which came with a production grant of 1 year, and then I was able to get three and a half more years of salary and production money, and that was from the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK. That allowed us to shoot the bulk of the act of killing, and then once that we had the material, the scenes, many of the scenes you've seen, we were able to then a Danish producer, Sina Børre Sørensen, got involved with the project. She saw a presentation of it at a master class that in Copenhagen Docks, in the film festival there. I didn't give it. It was a friend of mine who gave the presentation. And she asked who's producing this, and we said, we don't really have a producer. We're doing it ourselves. And she said, well, I'd love to help you raise the money to finish it if you need that. And at that point, we had 1,000 hours of footage and no money. So we really needed help then, and she came in and became the producer of the film, raised Danish Film Institute support, other Nordic Film Institute support, NGO support, and then most of Europe's public service broadcasters. But obviously the man who turned out to be a big critic of the film in the UK never came around and supported the film. And that's good, because he didn't, as we know, he didn't want this film. He doesn't like it, so it's good he wasn't in it.
Okay, so that gets sort of the business stuff out of the way. I want to get back a little bit. I want to move on to Look of Silence a little bit more and get into that, because this is a film you just saw. But just on Act of Killing, one question. It has to do with what is a standard ethical question for documentary filmmakers, is how you deal with your subjects, especially knowing and maybe having a level of awareness that they may not have around their performance and how that performance might be received. And especially given what would become the huge success of Act of Killing as a documentary in terms of transcending, like, say, the normal audiences for documentary. What was your sense of responsibility to them? And did you discuss that with them? You know, this may be seen by a lot of people. Just how do you navigate that question?
Well, I think, first of all, when we were shooting the film, we couldn't get anyone from the film world interested. So it never occurred to me that the film it's my first film as well. I mean, I'd made some short films before, but it was really my first film. It never occurred to me that this film would do that. So that isn't something we talked about at great length, but we talked about, of course, this will come out and this will reach an audience. I think the most important thing I can say, though, is that I see filmmaking as, first of all, you look for themes. You look for questions, you look for methods, and then you look for characters who somehow embody those questions, who embody those themes, almost are metaphors for those themes. You look for people who embody the contradictions that you're interested in. You look for, like, almost living allegories. And then I try to find a filmmaking, to become as close and as intimate as possible with them, and find a filmmaking process with them that will help me answer those questions in cinematic terms, will help me understand as deeply as possible the themes. This is why I say I feel like I'm an explorer and not a storyteller. A storyteller finishes telling a story pretty intact as the person they were when they start telling the story. And this is my life. It's years of my life. So I don't want to be the same person at the end as I was at the start. So for me, I look for people with whom I can become very close and take a journey that will undoubtedly transform both of us, or all of us. And in the Act of Killing, I took that journey with Anwar. And in the Look of Silence, I took that journey with Adi. And Anwar, the question of what Anwar was, at the beginning, Anwar was just like the many perpetrators I'd filmed. He was vain, but I sensed this difference. He was vain and he was boastful, but I sensed this difference with his pain, and I sensed he wanted to talk about it. And by starting this process with him, and I realized that actually he was participating in this film not to glorify himself, but actually because someone was finally listening to what this has meant for him. Someone was finally listening to what this has done to him. Someone was finally interested in that. Because I realized that if we could show that even the so-called heroes of this atrocity, if they were destroyed by what they've done, then of course it wasn't heroic. If it was a lie, if they were destroyed because they knew that the heroism was a lie, then then the national lie should collapse as well, and I should be able to do what the survivors and the human rights community entrusted me to do, which was to expose the national lie, that the genocide was heroic. Now, in that sense, first of all, when we speak ethically, there's split loyalties. My number one ethical commitment working with Anwar was to the survivors and the human rights community. Absolutely. At the same time,
did he know that?
And he didn't know that. He couldn't know that. And so there was an element of deception or withholding on my part. On the other hand, I tried to be as honest as I could about my feelings, about what I felt the film was showing. Not only was he watching all of the scenes, but I would say very openly, especially once he started to open up about his nightmares, I was able to say, this is giving me nightmares too. This is absolutely horrible. There's a scene, if any of you have only seen the 2-hour version of The Act of Killing, you should certainly seek out the uncut version of the film. It's 2 hours and 40 minutes. It's what showed in most festivals, but it is not what showed in Berlin and Toronto when we were trying to interest cinema distributors in the film. And it's available in most countries on Netflix or DVD or whatever, wherever the film's available. And if it's not available, I encourage you to get it from Pirate Bay, where it is available. There's a scene in the long version of the film, in the uncut version of the film, where Anwar butchers a teddy bear. And it's the most awful scene in the movie, I think. And at the end of it, while we were shooting it, I could hear that Anwar's microphone was rubbing. And I stopped, I was behind the camera, I was holding the camera, and I said, I had to adjust his microphone. And Anwar said, "Josh, you're crying." And I didn't know I was crying. I felt my face, I said, I am crying. And he said, "What should we do?" And I said, "We should continue." And I was pretty open with him afterwards about the pain. I said, "I feel filthy. I feel what we're doing is filthy. I feel what you're showing is filthy. I couldn't sleep that night. I had nightmares the next night. I couldn't sleep the next night out of fear of the nightmares. Then I had nightmares again." And that went on for 8 months. It was a painful, emotionally frightening journey for me. And yes, I was also working with the survivors. And yes, that's a betrayal in a way. Except when Anwar saw the finished film, he said, "Josh, this film he was tearful, he was silent. Then he said, "Josh, this film shows what it's like to be me." And then he and I continue to be in touch every 3 weeks for the first year and a half, now maybe every month or 6 weeks. And we like talking to each other. I care for him. I miss him, actually. And he's killed 1,000 people. And he knows that I've just come out with the second film about the survivors. And he knows because he reads my interviews in the Indonesian media. He knows what I feel about the genocide. And he congratulates me for the look of silence. I'm not saying that Anwar comes out of all of this fine. But I don't think Anwar went into this fine. The stupid thing that Anwar did was not to make this film with me. The stupid thing that Anwar did was to kill 1,000 people. That's when he destroyed his humanity.
When the film Act of Killing, and we're going to segue quickly, but when that film came out and started getting the notoriety, the awards, et cetera, that it did, was there a sense that it impacted Anwar's daily life in any way? Did you hear from him about that?
Yeah, the film has helped to catalyze a transformation, I think, in how Indonesia talks about its past, particularly the media. The media in Indonesia now reports on the genocide as a genocide regularly, voluminously, The Indonesia's leading news magazine, Tempo magazine, published a double edition dedicated to the film, for which they sent 60 journalists around the country to show that the film is a repeatable experiment, that it could have been made anywhere in Indonesia. It's not just, the boasting is not something that the killers only did for me. They gathered 1,000 pages of testimony of killers boasting. They published 75 pages of it, plus a lot about the film, and came out in a double edition of the magazine. Journalists, that opened up this space where the media, in one fell swoop, I think Tempo magazine ended the mainstream Indonesian media's silence on the genocide. The public, of course, started talking about it in their workplaces, at home, and reporters started to visit Anwar. Now, the paramilitary group never blamed Anwar for making the film. I was in touch with him very frequently at the beginning to make sure that wouldn't happen. The leaders have distanced themselves from Anwar. I think that's only good for Anwar. But Anwar luckily hasn't been blamed. I've been blamed. So I receive threats, death threats by email mostly, Facebook all the time, and somewhat by a few times by phone, and then letter to the production company. So I don't safely return. I don't feel I can safely go to Indonesia at the moment, which is very sad for me. But Anwar, again, I feel is as okay as someone who's done what Anwar has done, as okay as he could be, in the absence of a national process that would help Anwar acknowledge consistently and consciously what he comes to see, glimpse, at the end of the film, which is that what he did was wrong.
Incredible. So just in terms of timeline now, trying to get these two distinct projects done, you're doing active killing. At what point do you engage in the film that's going to be The Look of Silence, and engage with it as a separate project, and when do you re-engage Audi in the making of this other film you're going to make?
So, of course, there's this old material that was shot from before I met Anwar, which you've seen today. But the core of The Look of Silence was shot after I finished editing The Act of Killing, but before it came out. Knowing that once it came out, I could no longer safely return to Indonesia, or was unlikely to be able to. There were times when I tried to film with Adi during the making of The Act of Killing, but it was just too difficult. It was, not only was the production of The Act of Killing very intense, the method demanded that I film everything. Every makeup test, every costume alteration was fascinating. Every daily life for the perpetrators was fascinating. So it was there was a lot to shoot. I mean, it's at 2 hours and 40 minutes, it's an epic, I think. And it was an epic production. And so it was hard to find the time to really, that the survivors needed. But also shooting with the survivors during the making of The Act of Killing made it almost unbearable to return to continue filming the perpetrators. It was really hard. We lost energy and momentum every time because it was so painful to go back. I think that's one reason why I understood early on that another reason why there couldn't be the survivors and the perpetrators in the same film. The Act of Killing's fundamental challenge is to ask you to approach a man like Anwar through me, through my closeness with him, and then to identify for even a moment with him. So you recognize that he's human and we're all potentially closer to perpetrators than we like to think, and to ask questions about what our societies are there for. And the moment you have a survivor in the same film, you run like as quickly as you can emotionally from the perpetrators and clutch to the survivors for dear life, so you have a safer place to identify. And so I knew we couldn't do the basic work that we needed to do if they were in the same film. So the bulk of The Look of Silence we shot after we edited The Act of Killing, and when I returned, I didn't know that Adi would be the main character, but I knew I would discuss, he had been watching with this mixture of sadness, curiosity, anger for, how long was it? 8 years. Watching everything, from 2010 we stopped shooting with Anwar. So 7 years, he'd been watching everything we had time to show him. And he had changed over the course of those 10 years, those 7 years. I knew that he used to go, his daily job was to go around testing people's eyes and selling them glasses. And some point over the course of those 7 years, he was so transformed by watching this material with the perpetrators that he found the courage to ask anyone over 60 what they knew about what happened in 1965, as you see early in the film. So he was like a traveling companion to me, and I knew I would start the process with him, and he then said right away, I want to meet these perpetrators. And I said right away in reply, no. And he said, I have to, because I need to see if they can admit what they did was wrong. If they can meet me, they can see they've killed a human being because they meet the person's brother. Then they'll admit it was wrong, and then I can separate the human from the crime, which I cannot do it so long as they're justifying the crime. But once they can say it was wrong, I can then forgive the human being. And that way, we, as he says to his mother in the film, we can live side by side, no longer as perpetrator and as victim, afraid of each other, but particularly with us afraid of them. But we can live side by side as human beings. And when I heard that, while I expected from what happened with Anwar that he would fail in getting what he wanted, I felt that the process would shed such important light on what truth and reconciliation should be, what it could be, and in the tension that undoubtedly, and I knew it was unprecedented for a survivor to go to a perpetrator like that, either in Indonesia or in nonfiction film. I can't think of any nonfiction film where, with the possible, and it's a peculiar example, with the possible exception of maybe Kazuo Hara as the Emperor's Naked Army marches on, I can't think of, and it's a strange outlying example, I can't think of any film where a survivor approaches a perpetrator and confronts them while the perpetrator is still completely in power. I think it's unprecedented in nonfiction film, and we have like some of the most impressive documentary programmers in the room, so if I'm wrong, you just tell me.
Sako, no?
Or Sean. Anyways, so I knew that there would be incredible tension provoked by these visits. I knew Adi had the composure to get us through them safely. I also knew that that tension would reveal exactly why the survivors are so afraid and why they have to remain silent. So I knew it would be insightful at the very least. I also thought that because I'd made the act of killing but it hadn't come out yet, the perpetrators tended, the ones who I'd met, who we would visit, who were involved with killing Ramli, I knew that they knew about the production of the act of killing, because if you've seen the act of killing, it becomes famous. They produced TV shows in Indonesia about the production. So I knew that they would think that I'm close with the national head of their paramilitary organization. They would think that I'm close with the governor of the province, the vice president of the country, the head of the police, the minister of youth and sport. I knew that they would assume all this, and therefore they would probably think twice before physically attacking us or getting us arrested. And so I knew if we shot those confrontations very quickly, like in a matter of days, starting with the lowest ranking ones and working our way up the chain of command, and then getting everybody out of Medan as quickly as possible, we had a chance of being able to make the film safely. I also knew Adi's family would have to move, and we talked about that from the beginning, and that's another story.
Well, I want to get back to that. So active killing is done, and you're back shooting Look of Silence. I mean, the films are so different conceptually and has aesthetic experiences. I mean, obviously they're more than that. How did you distinguish the two in terms of you as a filmmaker aesthetically conceiving what these two experiences would be like for the viewer, and how do you distinguish them now that they're both done? And maybe talk a little bit why Look of Silence feels different than active killing.
Yeah, I really can't wait to see. I think the first festivals where they play the films back to back will be coming soon. I really look forward to seeing that. So then I'll know more what I think about how they are together now. But I think that the uncut version of the act of killing, every horrific, surprising, shocking, funny, surreal passage ends with, almost every single one ends with an abrupt cut.
Pretty hard cut. Yeah.
A very hard cut. And some of those are smoothed out and shorter, or they're shortened in the shorter version. But in the long version, you can see these very hard cuts out of the perpetrator's world into these sort of haunted landscape tableaus, such as you saw many of today in The Look of Silence. And they tend to have one or two figures in them. And those moments are abrupt shifts in the perspective of the film, I think, from that of the perpetrators to the absent dead that I hope haunt every frame of the work of the sections with the perpetrators. And I knew that in The Look of Silence, I wanted to make a film that would make the viewer feel like, what would it be like to have to build a life in one of those haunted spaces as a survivor with these men all around. So I knew that The Act of Killing, of course, it's a film about escapism and fantasy, as I said earlier. I knew it would be a flamboyant film, a kind of fever dream. I thought one of my inspirations was Hieronymus Bosch, the painter. And I knew that The Look of Silence would illuminate the act of killing. And the act of killing would, if I succeeded, illuminate The Look of Silence by being almost not its formal opposite and not simply different, but its mirror almost. That where the act of killing is flamboyant, this would be very restrained and precise. And I knew that The Look of Silence is a film about absence, the absence of Ramlee, the absence of the ability to talk, the absence of the ability to somehow a film about the absence of sound, the absence of words. And I knew that when you make a film about absence, you have to be very sensitive, and you have to be you can't let the cameras kind of fly off with the perpetrators hurtling over themselves the way the cameras in a film like Gravity do, as a kind of metaphor. You would have to have a very, very precise quiet. I knew that The Look of Silence, of course, refers to the look on Adi's face as he's watching, but I knew that my challenge artistically was to convey to you, what does this silence look like?
Which you did very powerfully, as you just experienced. I do want to get to some questions that you might have in a second. I just want to talk a little bit more through Look of Silence, particularly the scene, rather unflinching sort of scene with the family, and your role as a director in that scene, and Adi's role. I didn't even know what my question is, to be honest, but talk about the shooting of that scene, which is a really important scene and complicated, and you get involved with some off-screen direction, or the final confrontation. Talk a little bit about that scene, how it came to be, why you didn't turn off the camera when they asked you to turn off the camera, shut off, sorry, not the camera, but the laptop, and how you were thinking on your feet as a director when that was all unfolding. It's an incredible, incredible scene.
That was, that's a very important scene in so many ways. Of course, not least because the political mess, the mess that it leads to, that comes, the chaos that it creates. I chose to end the movie with that. And I, of course, could have ended it with the previous scene where the daughter finds the dignity and the grace to apologize on her father's behalf. I didn't choose to end there because I thought that would be a dishonestly hopeful ending. Even though it is still genuinely hopeful, I think, her humanity. But I chose to end with this because I felt it embodies the mess that is the trauma, the mistrust that's just under the surface, and that only a process of truth and reconciliation can actually heal. And it also shows that, of course, truth and reconciliation cannot be a one-man process. You need a social process, a political process. You probably need a real shift in power, or you need human rights organizations and the ordinary citizens to make demands of government. But what happened, that was a scene where we couldn't shoot the scene that we intended to shoot. I had spent 2 months during the 2-year period of, as I said, the walk to the river was the genesis of this whole process. And so I didn't let go of Amir Hassan right away, the man with the book, and move on to other perpetrators. He was talking about this, as you saw, in front of his wife and in other moments in front of his kids. And I'd worked with that whole family to dramatize, or to reenact, and to talk about how he might dramatize, almost sort of in a similar vein to what, nothing is complicated, but the direction that Anwar would later go in. I'll just explain it, actually. He had been, at the time of the killings, Amir Hassan had been the village elementary school art and drama teacher. And because of his role in the killings, he'd been promoted to be the head of the Ministry of Education, of Education and Culture for the whole region. And that's a great job if you want to get bribes. So it was a very big promotion and made him prosperous. And a reward for mass murder. And yet after we shot the scene at the river, he complained, as you saw, that he hadn't brought along his machete. He wasn't happy with the scene. He said, I'm a theater director, and I still direct plays in the village, and I could make a play about this that would be much better. And he proposed that he make a play out of his illustrated memoir. That memoir is one of the most amazing books I've ever seen. It's written in the first person, from the perspective of his dead victims. So it's the ghosts watching their friends being killed, and after each murder, they pass the narration on like a baton to the next ghost. And he proposed to do, and I think his reason for doing this was much like Anwar's reason for making these fiction scenes, trying to run away from the horror, trying to encapsulate, bury the pain in the scar tissue of words and drawings, sketches. Anyways, he proposed to me, Joshua, why don't we make a play in my village and with the surviving members of my death squad and my family of the book. And the family, so I had worked with him for 2 months at the start of that process. We didn't finish it because he had diabetes that got worse, and 2 of his children died in the Aceh tsunami. They were living in Banda Aceh, and his condition deteriorated and he didn't have the energy to continue. But in fact, that was an important time in shaping my thinking of what would be possible with Anwar when Anwar also wanted to continue, but this time inspired by his favorite Hollywood films. Anyhow, because of that, I'd spent 2 months working with that family, and because of that, the whole purpose was that Adi would go and say, look, we're neighbors. You've known me since I was a child. The wife was also an elementary school teacher. You were my primary school teacher. We live side by side. One day, my daughter might marry your grandson. It's not your fault what your husband did. It's not your fault what your father did to the sons. That was the intention. But because they knew who he was, they recognized him as coming from Ramli's family, and because of that, they denied knowing anything. And that meant that Adi couldn't have this conversation. So you hear me at some point say, look, Adi's here to speak openly. And all of this back narrative, which we also talked about in the scene, was too complicated to put in the scene. It was a long explanation from me. But I was determined to get them to acknowledge what they had known, to admit they were lying, so that we could have the conversation we intended to have. That's why I'm asking them to watch the footage. It's not because I'm punishing them. It's I'm trying to get past the lie, and we failed. Because the mistrust, the broken between them and Adi was too great. Their mistrust of Adi was too great. So that's the origin of the scene, and my intervening, of course, creates this chaos. And when we were editing the film, a number of people at screenings would say to me, Joshua, it's clearly a mistake for you to go beyond where Adi's willing to go. He's your protagonist. It's a mess if the storyteller sort of splits from the protagonist, particularly this late in the film. And I said, I felt it's exactly that mess that will make this film true. And so I stuck to it. I'm happy I did, although I'm sure some people criticize the film for that, or will criticize the film for that.
I think now would be a good time to ask if you all have any questions for Josh about that scene that we just talked about Look of Silence. I can continue asking questions, but I think it'd be good to get some any sense, or you're just happy for me to keep? I'll just keep on. If you have a question, now's the time to jump in. Now's the time to jump in. But it is, I think, one of the most powerful scenes I've seen in a documentary, and I think I'm glad you left it in. It is complicated, but it's phenomenal.
Thank you.
I want to. Oh, go ahead. Okay, we're gonna give you the mic to ask the question.
Yeah.
Do you think the reason at the time the family didn't say actually the truth was also part of it is fear?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're afraid also. I mean, if you have, absolutely, I think it's fear. It's Adi comes. I mean, Adi comes with a foreign filmmaker who they must know has all this footage incriminating the father, except that when I was working with them, it wasn't criminal what the father did, it was just what he did. And then someone they maybe recognize as the brother of their most notorious victim, because remember what I said about how everyone would talk about that victim, comes to your house. That must be, I don't think they were afraid in the sense that they were trembling with fear, but I think they knew, now we're not going to talk about this.
Yeah.
And they, at the end of that scene, the older of the two sons started to phone the police. And I just sort of took his hand and took the phone from him and said, okay, I know you're phoning the police, it's fine, but I'm just going to hold on to your phone until we get out of here, and then I'm going to give you your phone back. And there was such decorum in the room because the mom was there, because they knew me, who knows why, that I got away with that. And we left.
So even though it was off camera, they couldn't sort of, like have this closure actually for Adi, even though it's off camera.
No, well, I see what you mean. No, it was much more, because I don't know if it's that they're afraid of it. I can't be certain. I wonder, were they, I mean, they're not just afraid of what's on the record in terms of the camera, they also know I have this old footage. They could be afraid of a judicial process. They could be afraid. It's just not comfortable if your father's murdered 30 of your neighbors and then one of the neighbors' brother turns up. It's just one of those things that it's not like, it's just such a profoundly uncomfortable situation that people, they didn't open up. And I'm not sure that once we were done filming also, to be honest, we were pretty determined to get out of there as quickly as possible, because he'd started to make the call. I remember Scray, the cameraman, noticing first that he was calling while we were still shooting, and I knew we were saying, okay, let's pack up and leave.
But Adi's still living in the village at that point. At what point do you relocate him? Do things get tense for him after that? Does he have problems?
Adi actually wasn't living in the village anymore. Adi was living in Medan. He was, but I don't think they necessarily knew that, but they recognized him because he grew up in that village. We would not tell them who Adi was while we were shooting, except you saw when he chooses not to say where he comes from. And Medan's a huge city. It's about the size of Busan, I guess. And so it's hard to find an Adi, which is a very, very common Indonesian name in Medan. We spent the last 6 months working very closely with Adi's family to try and make the best out of the terrible situation that they should have to move, given that the only reason Adi wanted to meet these men was to forgive them. It's pretty terrible that he should have to run away and move. It's a profound injustice. It's a sign that Indonesia is nowhere near the democracy that it claims to be, that there's certainly not the rule of law that would give a democratic process, which Indonesia does have, although they just have rolled it back. There's certainly not the rule of law that makes democracy meaningful. There's not the accountability and the transparency that makes democracy meaningful. You can go through elections all you want, but if there's no rule of law, because whoever is powerful is feared and can do whatever they want, the elections don't mean anything. They really mean nothing. Nothing. So, anyways, we've worked very closely with Adi over the last 6 months to help the family, to figure out a way that we could make the best of this situation by moving the family. We've moved them they've moved thousands of kilometers to another part of Indonesia, to a much more supportive community of filmmakers, human rights activists, critical journalists who are very involved with their everyday life and the kids' new schools. The kids are in much better schools, but it's terrible that they should have to move. And it's something that very quick, Adi made a mistake, I think, in the filmmaking process of not telling his wife right away what he was doing when he met even the lowest ranking perpetrator. And he meets her as you see in the film, and tells her about it. And she then, after that scene, she wanted, of course, to see the footage that we'd shot so far. And then she decided that she felt it was worth doing what he was doing, that she understood why it was important. She could see what would come of it. And so she was then supportive of the rest of the production, and then she and Adi and the kids met us in Thailand for 2 weeks because I couldn't go to Indonesia to meet them, to talk about to see the film, to talk if there were changes we should make for safety's sake or not, to make sure they were fully comfortable with the film, and then to plan what we could do, what measures we would take to ensure their safety.
And again, anyone could jump in at any time now. I'll just keep going now. Oh, okay, go ahead. We'll give you a microphone now.
I'm just wondering if Look of Silence is released in Indonesia. If so, what's the reaction is like from the general public or the press or the government?
I would just add to it in terms of like how much was active killing seen in Indonesia, and then yes, what's going on with Look of Silence.
So we couldn't release the active killing commercially in Indonesia because to do so, or we didn't dare, because to do so you first have to submit the film to a censorship board. And there was a real risk, there still is, I think, a real risk that if we were to do that, the censorship board would ban the film. And if the film's banned, it becomes a crime to watch the film at all. It criminalizes any screening, and that in turn becomes an excuse for Pancasila youth, the paramilitaries, the thugs, the army, the police to physically attack screenings. And we didn't want that to happen. So instead we set up an infrastructure for community screenings where people could get the film for free and organize their own screening with our help. Some screenings were very big, 600 people at a university, 800 people in a big cinema screening from DCP. And some screenings were small in villages. But there were thousands of screenings, and increasingly because the press was so, by and large, positive about the film, and because the press started to talk about the genocide more and more openly after the film premiered, the screenings started, many of them were closed or by invitation at first, and then they became more and more open. So most of them, by the end, were public. Still, there were people afraid to request copies of the film. And so then we realized we had to make the film available for free download in Indonesia and to put the film on YouTube for free in its Indonesian language copy. The film, and in the uncut version. The film has been downloaded and seen on YouTube millions of times in Indonesia. The film has been screened thousands of times, which is way beyond what we could ever get for a documentary release in a cinema in Indonesia. And it's not just that people are seeing it, it's also the right audience seeing it. The Look of Silence we expect will come out in the same way, although we're hopeful that there's a chance, we're exploring the possibility of giving it to the censors because there's a new president who may prove to be better. But we don't know. Anyways, that it hasn't yet premiered. It's brand new. I mean, the film first premiered in Venice a month ago. The film has had press screenings in Indonesia, and the first reviews have come out. There was a 14-page special report in Tempo magazine last week about the film, but the film hasn't really met an Indonesian public. The reviews are very strong and are suggesting what we hope, which is that the film shows that truth and reconciliation ought to be within our grasp and that we really need it.
Thank you.
Calvin, go ahead.
From watching both films, I sense that through the process of filming, Anwar became more self-aware, like watching himself killing, and because of that, he developed a kind of feeling of shame. And from the Look of Silence, through the act of filming, Ari developed similarly a sense of awareness, and also built him a kind of courage. And how this media affects these characters. I mean, the process of filmmaking affect these characters were very interesting, and you also mentioned that you have changed. I was wondering what that change was in terms of how you became more self-aware.
Really hard to answer that question because it's about me, and you always have trouble seeing yourself. But I think that it's changed me in so many ways because it's been the last 10 years of my life. I've done nothing else but make these two films. And it's, of course, made me unwilling to tolerate any justification of atrocity at all. I don't see the fact that the killers are human and that we should see their humanity as justifying their actions. I see that as saying we have no chance of understanding how human beings do this if we deny the fundamental fact that the perpetrators are human. So it's made me unwilling to countenance even the slightest justification. There's a lot of intellectuals in Indonesia who have their time, who became powerful through, as intellectuals, through the generation that brought the dictatorship to power. And they'll say things like, well, one thing these two films doesn't show, it shows what happened, but it doesn't go into the why. You know, what were the, and they're not talking about, when they say that, they're not talking about the CIA incitement to mass murder, which was also happening. And they're talking about, you know, what might the communists have done that could justify this? And I feel like the moment someone starts justifying mass murder of non-combatants, you're justifying crimes against humanity. And it's fine if you want to do that. So I've become very intolerant for that. I've also become, maybe I've always been this way. I feel like I was this way as a little boy too. I saw a video of me recently when I was 13 years old, and I was expecting to see someone I didn't recognize. I was playing around with my friend, and here was this kid. He was, my voice hadn't broken. I'm not sure my voice is still broken. Has it? I don't know. Anyway, I've always wondering about that. But here was this 13-year-old kid who looked just like me, acted just like me. His sense of humor, it's only deteriorated since then. It's gotten worse. I feel less mature than I was then. So maybe we don't change, but I feel like one thing that I did change maybe is I've become more forgiving. If someone is, I've learned that from Adi too, that if someone's willing to say this was wrong, then I'm certainly willing to forgive, which simply means I'm not willing. It simply means I'm not willing to make the leap from saying you've done something bad to you are bad, and to be very scared of that leap and vigilant about it. And I think the other thing this has done to me is help me confront what I'm most afraid of. I think I said that the production of these films was frightening emotionally, and when you confront your fears, it's less frightening. You enter a state of greater humanness. I think a nation might be afraid to confront its past, but when they do, they'll find all sorts of opportunity for the future that's closed until we confront our past. So we need to be able to confront our fears, and I think even in life, even professionally, the fear of failure. I think the fear of taking risks. I've taken what felt like big risks to me formally and in terms of the kind of film I made and giving it so much time and refusing to give up. If this film is strong or if they're unique in any way, it's not because I'm clever, it's simply because I kept going and I kept going deeper and trying to figure out how do I get deeper? How do I get deeper? If there's still something I don't understand, instead of saying, oh, I can already tell a good story, let's edit, I kept going. And of course I've been lucky in that I've had resources to do that, but I think I think a lot of us stop at different points because of different fears. Fear that it's taking too long, fear that there's too much footage, fear that I won't, when I need to finish this so that I can get the recognition and move on to something, whatever it is. And certainly fear that what you're looking at is too ugly to bear. But so fear is the enemy. I've learned that.
I mean, along with the fear, I mean, most of the producers and filmmakers here, in a best case scenario, will spend the next 2 or 3 years working on the projects they're developing in this clinic. You spent 10 years plus on these 2 films. There had to be some real low points along the way. Talk about, first of all, sustaining the stamina on many levels to do that, and about how and what it took to push some of those through some of those low points.
Well, also, you have to remember I was totally unknown. Even shooting The Look of Silence, we hadn't released The Act of Killing yet. So I was completely unknown. I was seen as like, who is this guy? He's spending 10 years of his life making a film. No film funders were even supporting the work. Why does he, why should we think this is going to turn into anything? And that was hard. I mean, I remember the method that I used in The Act of Killing to kind of make that filmmaking process feel like a reality for them, to make it theirs, so that it's a real for them, meant that they had to go through all the steps. They had to have costume tests, makeup tests, script workshops, all the things with their friends. And all of it was fascinating. I would film all of it. So I would come home from shooting. Some days we'd shoot with multiple cameras 25 hours in a day. In 3 days, we'd have 75 hours. It was horrible. It was like, I'd go back to my partners here in the back, Shu, who was in Indonesia for part of that. I could never have made this without your support, either of these films. We've been together for 16 years. I love you very much. But anyways, I went to I remember going home with this footage at night, and I remember like keeping you awake, panicking, knowing that I was getting something amazing, but panicking because there was a lot of repetition, I never got bored. I knew it was interesting, but I just would be panicking. And I remember going home once. Do you remember when we got home and I had like the musical number and the 2 of the musical numbers and the cowboy scene and the gangster scene, and I was like, we were moving into a new apartment and we were having to paint the walls, and I remember, because they were gross before, they had like shit and stuff all over the walls. We were painting these walls, scraping the shit off the walls, and I remember just breaking down and crying, like thinking, who has ever in the history of movies shot musical numbers and cowboy scenes and gangster scenes, and there's not a single producer, there's not a single supporter who's waiting to see any material? Like, never has that happened. I could have put the stuff under my bed for 50 years and no one would miss it. That's what I thought. And like, so just to feel, I remember going back and being embarrassed even with my crew. Like, I would go back to my crew and I'm like, we've got to go back and shoot more. And they'd like, you're crazy. We have like 700 hours from the last shoot. I say, no, there's still this whole other area of, and each shoot would generate something really important. Like, if one shoot would be the gangster scenes and the attack on the village, the next shoot would bring the musical numbers, the next shoot would bring Anwar at the end watching the footage, the next shoot would bring him retching on the roof. And it was like everything was important, but I was embarrassed. Just to keep the confidence up was really hard, really, really hard. And it's, of course, much easier now because I've done these 2 films. But and to some extent, one of the things that's hard after you've done one film is that, oh, well, what about the next film? And a lot of that pressure is taken off by The Look of Silence. But at the same time, I'm finishing a 10-year chapter in my life, and like I feel like I'm staring out into the great abyss. What now, right? Do I have these methods that I think could do so much more. I have all these themes and questions that I'm starting to research. I'm trying to start something up new. But at the same time, I'm like, well, should I quit and become a glaciologist, which has been my other passion since I was a child, glaciers? Or should I become a theoretical physicist, which is what I went to college to do in the first place? So I'm going to keep making films. I've made that decision. But it's scary. It is scary. It's constantly scary. Maybe sometimes people say you're so brave, and Shu sometimes just shakes his head like because he knows the truth. I'm such a coward and a wimp. And that's just me.
Amazing. Yes, in the back we have a question. So if we can get the gentleman a microphone.
But you can't ask your question unless you send me a link to your film. He's made a great film I've heard called Nonfiction Diary. It was at the New York Film Festival. I want a link.
제가 영어를 잘 못해서 옆에 통역을 조금 부탁드리려고 합니다. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to translate.
Yeah. Yeah. 그 사실 저는 두 편을 다 봤고 너무 둘 다 좋았는데 그 좀 신기한 경험이었었던 게 뭐 어떤 거였냐면 액트 오브 킬링을 봤을 때는 그 주인공의 팬이 됐었고 요번에 이제 차기작이었던 이제 그 로고 오브 사이언스를 보고 나서 감독의 팬이 될 수 있었다고.
Okay, I've seen both of your films and I really admire them. But actually I had this strange experience, sort of strange feeling, which is when I watched The Act of Killing, I became a fan of the main character. And after seeing The Look of Silence, I actually become your fan.
그러니까 이런 식의 비유를 들었던 이유는 제가 이 영화 보고 나서 오히려 이제 그 인도네시아 액트 오브 킬링 사건을 다루지만 그 감독의 캐릭터가 더 많이 느껴져서인데 사실은 그 부분에서 이 편집 구조에 관한 어떤 질문을 조금 드리고 싶다.
Okay, the reason I felt that way is, I suppose, it's because the second film from the second film I could feel more of your character from the first one, and through this I would like to question the structure of the editing.
사실 제가 보기에 이 영화에서 가장 중요한 거는 인터뷰와 인터뷰 사이에 있는 어떤 인서트가 주는 어떤 감정이고 그리고 그 감정을 뒷받침하는 거는 이 영화의 어떤 사운드스케이프였던 것 같은데 앰비언트를 에디팅해서 만드는 사운드스케이프였던 것 같은데 그런 부분에서 이제 사운드 디자인을 할 때 어떤 것들을 좀 더 고민하셨는지가 일단 좀 궁금하다고. 예.
Okay, so I think what is really interesting about this film was the sort of the insert between the interviews, and I think you made it through the soundscape and the ambient. And how did you construct that?
We knew that the skeleton of the film would come from these confrontations where Adi goes and meets the perpetrators. And earlier in the film from the old footage that he's watching. But we knew that sort of the flesh of the film, what it's about, is this question I asked earlier, what does it do to a human being to live for 50 years in silence and fear? And we knew that the film, as I said earlier, would try and grapple with what does silence look like. And I think that we kind of, should I say, it was very intuitive, first of all, the editing process. We didn't know. I was working with the same editor that I made The Act of Killing with. We'd made it only when we started editing, 6 months before, so maybe 8 months before. So it was kind of like we knew each other so well, and we were dancing. It was like dancing, the process. We put down the first shot, the second shot, the third shot. We edited the first 5-minute opening in, I don't know, a day or two. And I don't think we've touched a frame in that opening. It's not, and that's not normally how you make a film. You don't normally start at the beginning. And then we just kept building from the beginning to the end. And we moved around a couple of the confrontations, moved them back. But basically, the first assembly of the film was like a third rough cut would normally be. And so a lot of it was intuitive. So it's really an interesting question. But I think I had this feeling that there was a kind of, the flesh of the film would be with this family and these very poetic moments with the family and with the, and there was, and the sound, the silence shouldn't really be silence. And it shouldn't be film silence where there's just a neutral ambience. It should be like swarming. It should be like the way that, this tabletop appears to be hard and simple, but actually it's a maelstrom of subatomic particles that are in constant motion. And I go like this, and the reason it hurts is because the electrons on this table are repelling the electrons in the molecules of my finger. And there's all this stuff happening in this placid surface. I felt the silence is the same. It should be, and I was inspired very much by Bresson and Ozu here in thinking about this, that the silence, these moments of quiet where there's this, are pregnant with something bursting out. And there's metaphors for that all over the film, not just the jumping beans, but also the swarming swallows at dusk. It's kind of, it's a dusk scene, but there's energy and motion everywhere, the cobwebs that are moving in the air currents. And of course, the sound of silence, which is pulsing. And because the whole film was meant to feel like we've entered those silent spaces that punctuate the act of killing, I knew that there would be a lot of crossfading in the sound, whereas in the act of killing, there's almost none. It's almost, except in some of the nightmare sections and dream sections for Anwar, and in the burning of the village, which becomes dreamlike, there are there, but normally there's none. When the film becomes a fever dream, there are crossfades in the sound in the act of killing. But there's none normally. It's hard cuts, hard cuts, hard cuts. But here, once you enter that silence, if you're never going to leave it, there shouldn't be any hard cuts inside of it. So there's hard cuts when we leave to go back to the perpetrators, and there's hard cuts when we come back. And when we come back into the silence, often the silence is the sound of these insects, which are, of course, have a rhythm and a swarming quality. So it's not silence, it's energy, it's life, it's action, it's living and dying and pulsing. And the insects were not simple in the sound design. We had 3 layers of insects, each with different volumes relative to each other, each with different qualities of reverb on them, changing depending on the scene, changing if you're in a silent section, if you're inside the house and you cut outside, there's like a kind of solo cricket that's like bop, 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 and then there's like a kind of chorus of crickets, and the balance between the 2 shifts, the reverb shifts. The sound was very important. We spent, for a documentary, we spent an incredible amount of time on the sound. We were able to do that in part because we had very little money to shoot the film with, because it was before The Act of Killing came out, so I was still nobody. We were shooting with Sony EX1s and Canon 5Ds and no sound recordist, just me putting radio mics on people when I could. And to make the sound as it is, we spent 3 months of sound editing and 5 weeks of mixing, which for a documentary, even for a fiction film, that's respectable. But for a documentary, it's kind of unheard of unless there's a big score that you're mixing. And of course, there's no score. There's no music.
저 한 가지만 one more case 예. 한 가지만 더 하면 저도 그 연쇄살인범을 주제로 한 영화를 만들어서 비슷한 고민을 한 적이 있는데, 결국 악이란 것이 개인에서 출발하는, 개인의 캐릭터에서 출발을 하는 건지, 아니면 시스템이 그런 것, 시스템이나 뭐 국가나 이런 것들이 악을 더 그로업시키는 건지, 어느 쪽이 더 맞다고 생각하는지 좀 그게 좀.
I was actually haunted with the same question that you seem to have, because I was making a film about the serial killer, and I wonder if you think that the evil stems from the individual or the system itself.
The big question is evil within the individual, or this notion of the banality of evil being within the system.
I don't say this to try and escape the question, but the terms are wrong. There's no individual and there's no system. You can't separate them. It's one. I could answer with some sort of self-righteous comment, well, if I grew up in Anwar's family in the 50s, and I've said this in many shorter Q&As, so, but it's a stupid answer. If I grew up in his family in the 1950s and then in 1965, would I make different decisions? I hope so, but I don't know. And I'm very lucky never to find out. I could say that. I believe that. But the really important, really serious issue is that how can you separate the individual from the system? We're social. We learn language. Language is social. Language is, we know ourselves only through language, which is a social phenomenon. We know ourselves only through stories that we get from others. The system is something, we cannot survive without societies that we build together. We feed ourselves through it. If I were put in the woods on my own, I wouldn't know how to feed myself or survive. I would die. We're like ants, you know. I'm not saying that all that exists is the system either. We're different from ants. and that we become individuals. And so I think that you can't separate it philosophically. And so if you insist on separating it, all one can say is, I don't know, both, maybe. But in reality, there's no separation between the individual and the social, not just because we're all social, but because we also are all one.
Well, I think on that huge existential question, we have to actually wrap up for time reasons. It was a fascinating conversation. I hope you guys got something of it. I appreciate your questions. I know I learned a lot. And thank you so much for these masterworks and for coming and sharing your thoughts with us.
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks for coming, and good luck with your films.